A billionaire CEO, a $5 billion deal, and the arrogance of one careless word. When he called a black waitress stupid, everything collapsed. In a single night, the fortune was gone. But what remained was a lesson about respect, dignity, and the quiet power of standing tall. The restaurant shimmered with the quiet elegance of wealth. Its walls were adorned with muted art, the kind only a few could afford to understand. And the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and imported wine. Tonight was not just another evening of fine dining. It was a night of negotiations worth billions. At the center of it all sat Charles Davenport, a man whose name alone could open doors in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. Billionaire, visionary, ruthless, that was the reputation he carried into every room. But reputations have a way of colliding with reality in the most unexpected places. Moving between tables with grace and quiet dignity was Maya Brooks, a young black waitress whose smile carried both warmth and resilience. To the guests, she was part of the background, a figure gliding silently to refill glasses, clear plates, and offer polite words that often went unheard. But behind her calm presence was a life built on persistence. A mother working double shifts, a student once denied opportunities, a woman who had learned to carry herself with poise even when the world tried to shrink her worth. For Charles, Maya was invisible, or worse, expendable. To him, she was just a waitress. And yet, fate was about to turn that invisibility into a spotlight so blinding it would cost him everything he thought untouchable. The evening began as planned. Investors from Dubai and Tokyo gathered around the mahogany table, nodding as Charles painted visions of expansion. Every sentence was crafted, every gesture rehearsed. He spoke of numbers and power with the certainty of a man who believed the world bent to his will. The deal on the table was enormous, $5 billion, a partnership that would secure his legacy for decades. As Maya approached with a tray of crystal glasses, she did what she always did, balanced professionalism with care. But in the delicate choreography of fine dining, one glass shifted slightly, clinking against another. It did not spill, it did not shatter, but it drew Charles's gaze. And in that single moment, irritation took root. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Are you stupid?" he said, his voice low but cutting. Each word dipped in disdain. The table fell silent. Maya froze, the words sinking into her chest like stones. For a brief second, she considered lowering her eyes, whispering an apology, and disappearing into the shadows as so many had done before her. But something within her resisted. She straightened her back, steadied the tray, and let the silence speak louder than his insult. The investors exchanged glances. Men accustomed to wealth and privilege themselves, they were not easily rattled. Yet in Charles's careless cruelty, they saw something they could not ignore. One of them, Sheikh Al-Mansour, adjusted his cufflinks and said softly, "Excuse me, Mr. Davenport. Did I hear you correctly?" Charles smirked, unaware of the weight gathering against him. "It's nothing. The staff should know better. Clumsy service ruins the atmosphere." Maya felt the heat rise in her face, but she refused to break. She stood, composed, her eyes steady though her heart raced. Every insult she had endured in her life, every classroom where her intelligence was doubted, every job interview where her skin was a silent disqualification, every time she had been told she was less, was condensed into this single moment. But this time, she was not the one on trial. The investors were watching, not just Charles but Maya, and in her silence, in her unbroken dignity, they saw a mirror of every injustice faced by those who served quietly while others flaunted power. It was Mr. Takahashi from Tokyo who finally spoke. "Respect is the foundation of all lasting partnerships," he said. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of decision. If a man cannot respect the people who serve him, how can he respect those who invest in him? Charles chuckled, waving dismissively. "Gentlemen, let's not exaggerate. She's just a waitress. Let's get back to business." The phrase lingered in the air like smoke. Just a waitress. Maya lowered her eyes then, not in defeat, but in quiet power. She placed the glasses gently on the table, her movements precise, unshaken. And though she did not speak, her silence screamed louder than any words could have. Because sometimes dignity does not need a voice. It needs only presence. The investors saw it. They saw the arrogance dripping from Charles's tone, and the grace with which Maya carried herself despite it. And in that contrast lay the truth. One man's billions could not buy the respect that one woman, unseen and underestimated, commanded simply by refusing to bow. As the evening unfolded, the shift was imperceptible to Charles, but it was undeniable. The investors' questions grew colder, their nods less frequent. They listened, but they no longer believed. They measured not just the numbers he boasted, but the character he revealed. And character, in the end, was the true currency of trust. By the time dessert was served, the deal was already slipping through his fingers, though he did not yet know it. For Charles, the insult had been a passing annoyance. For the men across the table, it had been a revelation. And for Maya, it had been a reminder. The world could try to strip her worth, but dignity, once held, could never be taken away. Charles Davenport was a man used to winning. Deals, debates, boardrooms, it didn't matter. Wherever he went, his confidence walked ahead of him like a crown. Tonight, he expected nothing different. The contracts were nearly finalized. The handshake was supposed to be a formality. In his mind, the insult he had tossed at Maya was already forgotten. A meaningless detail in the grand theater of money. But the room was no longer the same. Sheikh Al-Mansour's eyes lingered on Maya as she stepped away, her back straight, her silence unbroken. He noticed the way her hands remained steady even after being demeaned. How her dignity seemed to rise taller than the chandelier above them. He had grown up in palaces where staff were treated with reverence, not because of their position, but because respect was an extension of one's own honor. Watching Charles dismiss her as just a waitress was not only insulting, it was revealing. Mr. Takahashi adjusted his glasses, observing carefully. For him, respect was not negotiable. He had built his empire on loyalty, on teams who trusted him because he valued them. He had seen leaders rise with arrogance and fall with disgrace. Charles's words rang like a warning bell. Still, Charles continued, oblivious to the shifting winds. He boasted of market dominance, of technology his competitors could not replicate, of financial projections that glittered with certainty. His voice filled the room, but his credibility had already drained away. Maya returned to her station, the quiet corner near the bar, where she busied herself polishing glasses. Her mind replayed the moment, the sting of the insult echoing louder than the clatter of silverware. She had endured disrespect before, but this had been different. This time, powerful men had witnessed it, and though she hadn't spoken, she felt as though she had taken a stand simply by refusing to crumble. Her colleague, an older waiter named Samuel, leaned close and whispered, "You did good, Maya. Don't let that man break you." She offered him a small smile. "I'm fine." But inside, her heart still beat with the rapid rhythm of indignation and resolve. At the table, the investors were not fine. They were unsettled. Sheikh Al-Mansour finally interrupted Charles's monologue. "Tell me," the sheikh said, his voice calm yet probing, "how do you define leadership?" Charles grinned, sensing an opportunity to display his philosophy. Leadership is about vision, about having the courage to make decisions that others are too afraid to make. It's about knowing you're the smartest man in the room and guiding others accordingly. The words landed heavily. Across the table, Mr. Takahashi's expression hardened. He leaned back, folding his hands. And what of humility? What of respect for those who follow you? Charles waved dismissively. Respect is earned, not given. People at the top understand that. Those at the bottom, they play their part. The silence that followed was thick. Maya, though across the room, felt it. She could not hear every word, but she could sense the weight of the exchange. She knew men like Charles. Men who wore arrogance like armor, who believed kindness was weakness. And she knew that such men could not see the strength in those they dismissed. Dessert was served, delicate soufflés and imported fruits, presented with elegance. Maya approached again, this time to pour coffee. Her movements were measured, careful. As she leaned forward, Charles muttered under his breath, "Try not to mess this up." This time, Maya did not stay silent. She straightened, her eyes locking with his. Her voice was calm, even gentle, but it cut through the air like glass. Respect doesn't cost anything, sir, but it can cost you everything if you don't give it. The words startled him. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sheikh Al-Mansour's hand rose slightly, silencing him. "Well said," the sheikh murmured, directing his words not to Charles but to Maya. She dipped her head politely and walked away, her heart pounding. It had taken every ounce of courage to speak, but in that instant, she felt taller than she ever had before. Charles, however, was seething. How dare a waitress speak to him like that? He wanted to snap back, to reassert control, but the looks on the investors' faces told him he had already lost ground. Their admiration was not on him. It was on her. Mr. Takahashi broke the silence. In Japan, there is a saying, "The way you treat those who serve you is the truest measure of your character." The sheikh nodded slowly. Indeed, money builds companies, but respect builds legacies. Charles forced a laugh, trying to dismiss the moment. "Gentlemen, let's not get distracted. We're here to talk about billions, not about waitresses." But it was too late. The contrast between his arrogance and Maya's dignity had already decided the room. The investors had seen enough. By the time the final documents were brought forward, the sheikh pushed them aside. "I believe we will need to reconsider this partnership," he said firmly. Charles blinked, stunned. "Reconsider? What are you talking about? We've been negotiating this for months." Mr. Takahashi's tone was polite, but resolute. "Trust is fragile, Mr. Davenport. It can shatter in a single word. Tonight, you showed us who you truly are. That is not a man we can entrust with $5 billion. Charles's face drained of color. He stammered, tried to recover, insisted they were overreacting. But the decision was made. The investors gathered their papers, their assistants rising swiftly to collect belongings. Maya stood silently by the bar, watching as the titans of wealth filed out, their footsteps echoing like a verdict. She hadn't planned it, hadn't imagined it, but somehow her quiet defiance had exposed the truth. And Charles Davenport, the billionaire who thought himself untouchable, was left sitting in a chair that suddenly felt far too small. The fallout began before Charles even left the restaurant. News travels fast in a world where power is currency and arrogance is scandal. The investors' abrupt departure was not a private matter. It was whispered by assistants, noted by staff, and within hours, the story began to ripple through the city's financial circles. Charles stormed out, his face red with fury, his driver scrambling to keep up. To him, this was an insult greater than anything he had endured in his career. A waitress, a black waitress of all people, as he told himself, had dared to embarrass him, and worse, the investors had taken her side. He couldn't fathom it. He replayed the moment again and again, each time convincing himself that he had been right, that she had been clumsy, that respect was for equals, not for the hired help. But denial cannot rewrite truth, and the truth was already spreading. By the next morning, Financial journalists were reporting on the deal's collapse. Davenport's $5 billion disaster. One headline read, another more biting. Respect lost, deal lost. The whispers turned into questions, and the questions into speculation. How had a man once considered invincible in the corporate world lost the trust of such powerful partners overnight? At the center of it all was Maya, though she never sought it. She returned to work the next day, apron tied neatly, hands steady as always. But something was different. Her co-workers looked at her with quiet pride, some even with awe. Samuel, the older waiter, clasped her hand and said, "You held your ground. Don't ever forget that." She smiled, though humbly. "I just spoke the truth." The truth, however, had a way of echoing louder than she could have imagined. One of the investor's aides had recorded the exchange on his phone. Not intentionally at first, but as part of documenting the evening. Now, a 30-second clip was making its rounds in private groups. It showed Charles leaning back, muttering, "Are you stupid?" It captured Maya's composure, her calm, and finally her words. "Respect doesn't cost anything, but it can cost you everything if you don't give it." The clip was undeniable. By afternoon, it had reached the public. Social media lit up like wildfire. Hashtags appeared. Hashtag respect costs nothing and hashtag just a waitress. People debated, argued, applauded. For every voice that defended Charles, 100 others condemned him. The world was no longer the one he had dominated with unchecked arrogance. In this new era, perception was power, and perception was against him. Charles's PR team scrambled. They released statements about misunderstandings and taken out of context. He even appeared on a morning show, attempting to laugh it off. It was a light remark, he insisted. People are too sensitive these days. But the more he spoke, the deeper he dug his grave. Because the world had seen the clip. They had seen Maya's dignity. They had heard her words. And no amount of spin could erase the contrast between arrogance and grace. For Maya, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She had never sought fame. She had bills to pay, shifts to cover, a life that required steady steps, not the chaos of public debate. Yet strangers began arriving at the restaurant, asking for her by name. Some came to shake her hand, others to leave notes of encouragement. "You reminded us all that dignity matters," one letter said. Another simply read, "Thank you, Maya." Her manager, initially nervous about the spotlight, soon realized the restaurant was thriving from the surge of customers. But he also knew Maya was more than just a symbol to profit from. One evening, he pulled her aside. "You don't have to keep working if the attention becomes too much. But if you stay, know that we're proud to have you here." Maya thought carefully. She didn't want to be defined by one moment, yet she also recognized the power of it. "I'll stay," she said softly, "but I'll stay on my terms." Meanwhile, Charles's empire began to crumble. Stock prices dipped as investors questioned his leadership. Analysts dissected his downfall, pointing not just to the failed deal, but to a pattern of arrogance that now seemed undeniable. Employees whispered about the culture inside his company, stories of disrespect and intimidation surfacing like cracks in glass. One particularly brutal editorial read, "A man who cannot respect a waitress cannot respect a partnership, and a man who cannot respect cannot lead." Charles raged privately, throwing blame at everyone but himself. He told his board the investors had overreacted, that the world had gone soft. But when the boardroom itself began to turn cold, when shareholders began demanding accountability, he realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. And through it all, Maya's words continued to echo across the world. Respect doesn't cost anything, but it can cost you everything if you don't give it. She became, unintentionally, a voice for those who had endured the same quiet humiliations. Workers in restaurants, Cleaners in offices, drivers, nurses, secretaries, all shared her quote. It became a rallying cry, not just against Charles, but against a system that so often dismissed those who labored unseen. Maya remained humble, always reminding people, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just refused to be broken." But to those who watched her, she had done something more. She had reminded the world that dignity, once stood upon, could topple even the highest towers of arrogance. Charles had lost $5 billion in a single night. But in truth, he had lost something far greater. He had lost the illusion that money could shield him from accountability. And Maya, the woman he had called stupid, had proven wiser than him in the simplest, most powerful way. The world was listening now. And it was Maya's voice they heard, even in her silence. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. What had begun as a quiet insult in a dimly lit restaurant had turned into an international lesson in respect and dignity. For Charles Davenport, the consequences were brutal and swift. For Maya Brooks, the transformation was profound and unexpected. Charles's empire, once thought indestructible, was crumbling like sand under a tide. His board of directors convened emergency meetings, desperate to stabilize the company's image. Shareholders pulled out, unwilling to be tied to a man whose arrogance had become a global spectacle. Journalists unearthed more stories of his callousness. An assistant reduced to tears during a boardroom meeting, a driver fired for arriving 3 minutes late, an office cleaner berated for leaving a streak on a window. What had once been brushed aside as tough leadership was now evidence of a toxic pattern. Within 2 months, Charles was forced to step down. The announcement came not with applause or dignity, but with a terse press release and a stock price that had fallen nearly 40%. Billionaire or not, his reputation was stained, his name synonymous with arrogance. And the man who had once been invited into the world's most exclusive boardrooms now found many doors firmly closed. Meanwhile, Maya continued her quiet life, though the world refused to let her fade back into anonymity. Invitations arrived daily, from television hosts, from universities, from organizations advocating for workers' rights. Everyone wanted to hear her story, to place her on stages and in headlines. At first, she resisted. She had no desire to be a celebrity. She was a mother, a worker, a woman who wanted peace, not fame. But one evening, as she tucked her young son into bed, he asked softly, "Mom, why do people talk about you on the TV?" She hesitated, then answered, "Because I told someone that respect matters." "Does it?" he asked, eyes wide with innocence. "Yes," she said firmly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "More than money, more than power. Respect is everything." It was in that moment that she realized her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been belittled, dismissed, or overlooked. She did not need to be a celebrity, but she could be a voice for those who could not always speak. And so, slowly, she began to step into the role the world had given her. She accepted an invitation to speak at a local university. Standing nervously on the stage, her hands trembling at first, she looked out at the sea of faces, students, professors, workers who had come to listen. She began simply, "I am not special. I am not extraordinary. I am just someone who refused to accept disrespect as normal. That is all." Her words, like before, carried more weight than she realized. People leaned forward listening, not because she spoke with grandeur, but because she spoke with truth. She told them about dignity, about the quiet power of composure, about how respect is not something you beg for. It is something you live by. And when she left the stage, the applause thundered not for a celebrity, but for a reminder of humanity. Her story spread further, inspiring workplace reforms, sparking debates on leadership, even shaping corporate policies. Some companies began training programs built around the principle she had spoken. Respect costs nothing, but losing it can cost everything. For Charles, the humiliation lingered. He watched from afar as Maya's name became associated with dignity, while his became a cautionary tale. He tried to rebuild, but every step was shadowed by his past. At charity galas, people whispered. At meetings, potential partners declined. He learned the hardest truth of all. Arrogance builds walls, but respect builds bridges. And without bridges, even the richest man is stranded. One winter evening, long after the noise of the scandal had quieted, Charles found himself in a smaller, humbler restaurant. No cameras, no investors, just a man eating alone. As a waitress approached to refill his glass, he caught himself before speaking. For the first time in years, he looked up, met her eyes, and said, "Thank you." It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But for him, it was the beginning of understanding what he had lost. Maya, meanwhile, never stopped working. Though her platform grew, she remained the same woman who polished glasses and balanced trays. She reminded those who praised her that her strength was not unique. It was present in millions of others who served quietly with dignity every day. Her life was not transformed by money or fame, but by purpose. And in that purpose, she found peace. The story of Charles Davenport and Maya Brooks lived on, not just as gossip, not just as business history, but as a parable. A parable told in classrooms, in boardrooms, in dinner conversations. That wealth without respect is poverty, and power without dignity is weakness. Because in the end, it was not billions of dollars or boardroom strategies that defined the night in that elegant restaurant. It was one careless insult, one moment of arrogance, and one woman's refusal to bow. The billionaire lost a $5 billion deal on the spot. The waitress gained something far greater. A voice that reminded the world what true power really looks like. And her words, simple yet eternal, continued to echo. Respect doesn't cost anything, but it can cost you everything if you don't give it. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Every story we share is a reminder that dignity is priceless and respect is power. Stay with us for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift.